So welcome to this edition of the Warrior Leadership, Inspiring Ownership-Driven Leadership, and I'm with John Battersby. Welcome, John. So John, I had the good pleasure of meeting during my time, 15 years in England, where he headed up Brand South Africa, which is a very important arm and extension of South Africa, where it's the perception and not only for tourism, for business, promoting economics, but also the goodness of what we have to offer as a nation, which we often don't realize, which we'll touch upon that in a moment. But first, John, I'd like you to also share that historic moment where Nelson Mandela, take us back to the moment he was released from prison. The whole world was watching, and you had the good fortune and privilege to shake his hand and be the first person to engage with him in, let's say, as a free man, if you want to call it that.
Yes, it was kind of a defining moment for me, and it was completely unplanned. Nelson Mandela was due to be released at 3:00 on that fateful day, the 11th of February. I had, with some colleagues, just come down from Johannesburg to make sure that we were going to be in time for the event, because there'd been some toing and froing over exactly what day it was going to happen. And fortunately, we got on the last flight to get us to Cape Town, and we only just got on because we were late at the airport and so forth. Anyway, so on that day, I was due to be picking up my brother-in-law coming from France. Not picking him up, actually. Picking him up from the airport and taking him to the home in Hout Bay. And so as a result of that, I arrived at the prison warder's house. This is where Mandela was staying, or at least I arrived outside of it, because there was a whole battery of media and television cameras and ladders and all the rest of it. I arrived at 2:55, which was cutting it really fine. Most of the media had been gathered there since like 6:00 in the morning or earlier. And because I was my head was swollen that day, figuratively speaking, because of the historic nature of the moment, which one had been waiting for all those years. And I'd been writing about Mandela and writing columns about Mandela, and he'd written a foreword to one of his books in which he mentioned my column. So, I had all those kind of personal connections, but also just in a much broader historic sense, it was an extraordinary day. So I arrived at 2:55. I was wearing a blue cotton suit in the same color as the police blue, that sort of slate blue. I mentioned that because it probably helped me to be less noticeable than I would have been otherwise. And without really thinking about it, I walked into the gates, disregarding the rest of the media. I just walked in, and there the only other person in the enclosure at that stage was Clarence Cato of the SABC, who was the announcer for the day, the presenter. And he clearly had not prepared himself for what was to come, which was an hour's wait between 3 and 4 before Mandela finally emerged, with his colleagues from the Mass Democratic Movement, including Thabo Mbeki and various others, and of course Winnie Mandela, who was in a way the sort of most important person in the delegation. And I don't quite know what I did for that hour, but I did hear a lot of platitudes coming out from the SABC guy, because it was a brilliant day, it was beautiful weather, we were standing in these wonderful winelands of the Cape, and you can only say that so many times when you're talking to probably one of the biggest television audiences of the century. And it was a very hot day as well, so I made sure I was positioned close to a tap and also close to the combi van, which was Clarence Cato's kind of recording.
I remember that tap, by the way.
Remember that tap?
I'm filling up my water bottle, and then about 20 minutes later he repeated, And here I am filling up my water bottle. He was just
That's
keeping
right.
running commentary.
That's right. And so I took a few drinks out of the tap because it was a very hot day. And eventually the moment arrived virtually on the dot of 4 o'clock, so an hour late. And clearly there had been a very important conversation taking place between Mandela and the Mass Democratic Movement, which was basically the United Democratic Front plus some others. I've never seen an account of what they actually were speaking about, but one has had various explanations that there were elements of the speech that Mandela had prepared, which people in the movement were not very happy with. So there was a lot of toing and froing, but the one thing he insisted he would not compromise on was describing de Klerk as a man of integrity. So that remained in the speech, but I think probably quite a lot of the rest was changed, tweaked, nuanced. So eventually they walked, one saw Mandela, this towering figure, next to him Winnie Mandela, and they'd spotted the media, so they had the clenched fist in the air. I then moved forward from my inconspicuous position to sort of towards him, and he looked over in my direction and broke into a broad smile, and then that gave me the okay to walk up, shake his hand, and he then proceeded to face this battery of media on the other side. So that's how it came about, yeah, what can I say? It was one of those moments. It was caught on television. Some of the footage you still see today. Most of the networks have cut out that part because it's not immediately relevant. But it was, you could see me in profile. I got a lot of calls from people around the world saying, "Was that you? We saw shaking Mandela's hand."
No, thank you for sharing that moment with me and with us. He'll always be a standout in terms of leadership, especially during that period of the classic paradigm shift, where we have one mentality, or what it is to be South African, and suddenly it's completely different. People who served in the so-called SADF preparing for something, and the opponents, but then there's this togetherness after, and what it means to be together, which has always been and still is to some extent an identity crisis of what constitutes nationhood. And that's an ongoing work which we are all doing, and of course your time in Brand South Africa, you played a big part also in bringing the South Africanness to the fore. But going back to Mandela, what would you say is his standout legacy in terms of leadership?
Well, the standout legacy of Mandela's leadership is the way he lived his life, and the way he concentrated on that single goal of changing the order in South Africa, bringing to an end the apartheid era, which was based on racial exclusivity and rights. And he dedicated his life to that, not only in what he said, but what he did. And part of what he did was to actually subject himself to 27 years in prison in order to bolster his vision, his ambition, and his core project. So that is, I guess, a huge example of steadfastness, focus, resilience. But part of his legacy is also at a personal level. The Mandela that came out of prison was very different to the Mandela that went into prison. Different in the sense of having transformed himself, of having been into himself, and having dealt with a lot of his demons, so that when he came out, he could focus totally on the goal. And of course, during the time in prison, the group of the top prisoners had many discussions and many preparations, and it became known as the University of Robben Island, and they were able to plan and talk about the day when they would walk out of prison. But I think what made his example so powerful is that he said in some of the interviews I did with him, he said, look, I've read the biographies of famous people like Martin Luther King, like Mahatma Gandhi, like Winston Churchill, Mother Teresa, whatever. And that has been very formative for me because I've been able to draw from their various life stories the qualities you need to be a effective and powerful leader. And one of those things that he worked out at that time is that you cannot have resentment or a sense of revenge against your jailers, against the enemy, as it would have been called by the ANC, because if you do, it dissipates your energy to focus on the goal, which is to create a new South Africa in which everybody is included. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, when he met Bill Clinton in his cell, we took Bill Clinton to Robben Island after he'd been released, and they stood in the cell, and Bill Clinton asked him, but how do you manage to have no sense of bitterness or revenge against your jailers? And he said, if I had done so, I wouldn't have been able to do what I've done or what the organization has done, but he was able to lead it in order to bring people together afterwards, because the energy would have been dissipated. Mm. And the thing that struck one most, on first meeting Mandela, and I sat next to him at the Foreign Correspondents' dinner where he was the guest speaker shortly after he was released, is that he focused on you totally, so that there was no sense of actually anybody else around you, because he would give you his whole focus, because he was connecting with the common humanity between you. And he would say that, you can meet the most ordinary people and easily dismiss them, but if you just search a little bit in any person, you will find the humanity, and you will find that the potential for greatness is in everybody. It's a question of life circumstances and how others around them draw that out. So, and that's what he kind of did. He realized, he said that he'd realized in his life, and because before he went into prison, I of course didn't know him, but one of my mentors, Anthony Sampson, knew him very well, and said he was this very imposing, impulsive guy with quite a quick temper, and a woman fell at his feet, all of those things. And then when he came out, he was a much more considered person with a kind of inner calm that comes of having dealt with your own demons. And if one reads about his time in prison and his letters to Winnie Mandela during that period, you get a very good sense of what he went through, which at one level was incredibly painful in terms of not being able to see his family, not being able to see his children grow up, not being able to give the leadership to his family that he would like to have given. But that also developed his gravitas, his sense of his sense of authority and moral authority that he developed, so that when he stepped out of prison, he had actually done 90% of what he had to contribute to the country purely by his example. What he did after that was to become a symbol of reconciliation, magnanimity, forgiveness, and he would go and meet Betsy Verwoerd, for instance, and he would meet all those people who he would have totally dismissed in his earlier persona before he went to prison, because he realized now the job was no longer to win the battle.
Yes.
The battle had been won. It was now a question of developing the new vision and making it happen, and getting people through dialogue and understanding to see each other's point of view, and to negotiate the basis for a new South Africa.
So the enemy wasn't personal. The enemy was enemy of lack of shared vision. But once that was achieved, Betsy Verwoerd, for example, it was no longer the enemy, because the mission had been accomplished. The resentment wasn't maintained.
Yeah.
So the issue wasn't with the individuals, but their behavior, so to speak.
Yes. There was a clear, when he came out, he was able to have clarity, between the system and the individuals.
Mm.
So, for instance, he made friends with a number of his warders, which he then developed after he came out of prison. There were one or two who kind of he wasn't that happy with because they kind of were trying to get their own glory and writing their own books and stuff. But there were one or two, one in particular, that he developed a close relationship with, because he always said, and he always told his colleagues on Robben Island, we must treat our warders as human beings, not as our enemy or our jailers, because what we need to convey to them is that, in fact, to get them to understand that they are in fact in prison and we are free because of our ideals and because of the kind of vision that we have of the country. So he actually succeeded in turning that around, and there were, as I say, a couple of warders who really understood that process and who became genuine friends of his because they realized that their lives had been transformed by the process that he'd led in prison.
Oh, thank you. And lastly, we are often outward looking for solutions, especially in terms of how we can get the country working, and looking at leadership elsewhere, such as Gandhi, who is the ultimate, what you call the servant leader. There's also transformational leaders and so forth. But in terms of what we have to offer the world, we've also got attributes that we can offer that people can learn from us. And I'm sure you reside abroad, and you've also been, let's call it, an ambassador in a role, ambassadorial role, representing South Africa and our expo. What would you say we have to offer the world in terms of betterment for the world? What are South African attributes, positive?
Well, I think South African attributes and what South Africa can actually be an example to the world, and Mandela was a very big part of that. It couldn't, of course, happen without two to tango, so de Klerk also played an important role in that, because Mandela couldn't do it on his own. He needed a partner to negotiate with. What South Africa has given to the world is to show that if you have major differences, whether it's across racial lines or religious lines or demographic lines, or even national lines, whatever your differences, if you can understand the other person's point of view and where they're coming from, and you can communicate in a real exchange, you can resolve the matter and come to a compromise which averts going to a civil war or killing each other. And that's what South Africa has given the world. And as a result, some of the leaders of negotiations like Rolf Meyer, Cyril Ramaphosa, and others went and made this contribution for the negotiation of the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland. They went to Sri Lanka to help resolve the issue between the military government there and the Tamil Tigers, although that ended in a military victory in the end. But they gave advice in many situations, Darfur and Sudan and various other places, because South Africa had achieved that. It was not something that South Africans could talk about. It was something that South Africans could actually say, this is what we achieved. We negotiated across the table. We understood where the other side was coming from, and as a result of that, we could find something larger that united us than the smaller things that divided us. And that was the process that took place during those 3 or 4 years, between 1990 and 1994. And it will go down in history, already has, as having then given birth to one of the most enviable constitutions in the world. So people will then say, but what about now? Why have things gone so wrong? Well, I think Mandela, some people say he would be turning in his grave if he saw what was happening now, what had happened to the ANC, and so forth. I don't think so, because I think Mandela, in his historic intervention and his life's example of having sacrificed and spent 27 years in jail before coming out as this figure of moral authority and gravitas, was realized that this is a long-term vision. This is not something that's going to be solved. When you had 40 years of an oppressive regime and 350 years of colonialism, you're not going to suddenly flip a switch and change things around, although we all got a bit heady about the euphoria after the 94 elections, because it was a huge moment in history, and as you say, one was able to redefine one's own identity in terms of a shared South Africa and experience. I mean, many white South Africans had never even been into a black township, so it was a revolution of the mind in that sense for many people. But I think Mandela would have appreciated at that time that it wasn't all going to be plain sailing, that there was going to be a lot of up and down, a lot of suffering, and that's what we're seeing now, because it's one thing to have a political settlement whereby there is now no formal discrimination against anybody on the basis of color or ethnicity, and that's a huge step forward. But then you've got to deal with the huge economic issue, deficit, where a large part of the population are not much better off than they were. They're much better off in terms of human dignity and having the opportunity, but if you don't help people to realize that opportunity, you're going to remain in the doldrums. And some complain today that some people's lot is even worse off than it was under apartheid. But having said all of that, the huge turnaround that happened in 94 and between 1990 and 94, that's for the long term. Nobody's going to reverse that. There will be and have been difficult times. There will probably be more difficult times ahead. But nobody is going to be able to turn around the fact that South Africa now has a constitutional democracy with independent judiciary, courts, and that people are able to realize their rights in terms of that settlement that took place in 94. So no plain sailing, but forward to the goal of a shared and prosperous society.
Thank you, John.
Thanks very much.